The snow was already knee-deep when he wrapped his dying son in the last wool coat and shoved him into a hollow dug in the side of a drift. Not a cave, not a real shelter, just snow, compacted and scraped by hands near frozen stiff. But the wind was coming down like the devil himself had torn open the sky, and Harold Granger had 3 children left to shield. The baby was coughing blood, the firewood was gone, and his wife couldn't move her legs. And that's when he did it, when the whole world would later swear it was impossible. He built something from nothing but a snowbank, a half-burned kettle, and a single stubborn log, not for survival, for love, for defiance, for his family. No one remembers when the cold started exactly. It didn't matter. What mattered was when it stopped being cold and became something worse. Not winter, no, this was something meaner, older. The sky turned that shade of lead that swallowed the moon whole and made the trees snap with gunshot cracks in the night. The storm had rolled in 4 days back and never stopped, but it wasn't just snow and sleet. It was that kind of freeze that found your bones through 6 layers of wool and whispered, "You're next." Harold Granger hadn't planned for any of it. Who could have? Their cabin was already barely a cabin. Half logs, no insulation, just 4 walls, and a leaky stovepipe sticking up like a rusted finger accusing the sky. He had built it fast the year before after their last place burned. His plan had been to fix it up slowly once spring came, lay moss between the logs, dig a better root cellar, maybe get a new stove if trapping was good. But now the wind had broken 2 shutters. The stove barely heated enough to thaw a bowl of beans, and his oldest girl, Lottie, kept rubbing her fingers together to make sure they still moved. That morning, before the real storm rolled in, Harold had hiked out with his axe looking for downed branches. He came back with frostbitten hands and a bundle so thin it wouldn't last 2 hours. His wife, May, tried not to show it, but she'd started coughing deep and wet. She didn't complain when he fed the last dried meat to the kids, didn't ask when he lit the last log, and then just stood staring into the flames as if there was an answer somewhere in that glow. The baby, Jonas, was only 14 months, too little to understand, too small to handle this kind of cold. That night, as the wind wailed like a soul lost in the trees, Jonas let out a breath and didn't take another one right away. He gasped like someone underwater, red-cheeked and wild-eyed, and that was the moment Harold knew he couldn't wait any longer. The cabin was no longer safe, not with the way the roof creaked and the wind blew smoke back down the pipe. They'd freeze in there, or suffocate, or both. He needed something better, and he had nothing. So he did what no man sane would try. He took a spade and started digging into the biggest snowdrift he could find. Not far from the cabin, close enough to carry the children one by one, but not so close the cabin's collapse would bury them. He dug with that old rusted shovel until the handle splintered, and then kept going with his hands, numb as they were. At first it was just a shallow trench, but as the wind screamed and snow iced over his eyebrows, it turned into a tunnel, a hollow, a snow shelter. They don't teach you this in books, not in town schools or dry rancher stories, but somewhere deep in Harold's bones, in the panic and the pain and the cold, he remembered a thing an old Cree man once told him during a trapping winter long past. Snow doesn't kill, wind does, cold does, but snow just waits. Use it right, it'll hold in the heat. Use it wrong, it buries you. He'd thought it was just words back then. Now it was life. With scraped fingers and frozen wrists, Harold carved a dome inside the snowbank, thick enough to resist cave-in, just tall enough to crouch. Then he took the broken kettle, his only metal left, and shoved it into a packed corner, scraping coals from the last fire into it. One log, one stub of a log, barely more than a stick. That would be their heat. May didn't argue when he picked her up. She couldn't. Her breath came short and ragged, her limbs dead weight. Lottie walked on her own, arms wrapped around their middle child, Jack, who had been shaking uncontrollably for hours. He packed them in like goods in a wagon, close, tight. The baby last, cradled on May's chest, wrapped in the last warm thing they had, his own coat. Then he sealed the entrance with more snow, leaving only a tiny vent. No wind, no draft, no light, only breath and fear, and the low iron glow of a kettle burning a single, stubborn piece of wood. Inside that hollow silence, something strange happened. They didn't die, not that first night, not the next. Harold kept watch by the glow. He dozed in spells, rubbed the children's fingers when they stiffened, pressed his ear to May's chest to check for breath. When the log gave out on the 3rd night, he broke off a slat from his boot sole and lit that too. When that ran out, he fed in a splintered spoon, then a hairbrush, then the buttons off his own suspenders, burning whatever could give flame. It wasn't right, it wasn't sane, it wasn't anything a man would call a plan, but the snow held, and the bodies stayed warm enough. Outside, the storm clawed down from the mountains, something fierce. Trees cracked like rifle shots, birds vanished, the creek froze all the way through, something even the oldest homesteaders said never happened. Men in town started dying just from walking across the street. A widow's house caved in on her, and they only found her in the thaw. There were tales of cattle stacked stiff like logs, and dogs chewing bark off trees trying to find something warm inside it. But not the Grangers, not in their impossible shelter. Harold only emerged once, dragging himself out through the vent hole on the 5th day, eyes red, lips blue, shirt soaked in condensation from breath. He collapsed back into the snow, thinking it was over, not realizing the worst had yet to come. Because when he returned to the snow dome, crawling back in with a handful of kindling he'd found under a dead pine, he found May cold as stone, no breath, no pulse, but she was smiling, and the baby on her chest was still alive. And that was when Harold Granger made the decision that would turn a desperate shelter into something more than survival, something sacred, something eternal. And what he did next would haunt the mountain forever. Harold did not weep when he saw May's face frozen in that faint smile. He could not. The body gives up tears before it gives up hope. He just sat there, hunched, shaking in the little hollow they had carved together, feeling the steam from his own breath coat the roof in tiny droplets that refroze as glittering frost above her brow. Lottie didn't speak either. Her eyes, big and silent, stared not at her mother but at Harold, as if waiting to see what kind of man he would become in that moment. What kind of father? What kind of monster? Because the air in the shelter was now colder. The log was gone. The pine chips he'd brought in burned too fast. He had only found them because a tree had fallen in just the right way to make a sheltered pocket beneath it. Blind luck, or providence, or neither. He had crawled back through the snow vent like a mole, panting and weak, shoving twigs ahead of him as if they were gold, only to find death waiting inside. But the baby still breathed, and Lottie's fingers still moved, and Jack's legs still twitched in his sleep, curled tight against the base of the snow wall, like a hibernating animal. Harold stared at May's face for a long time, long enough that his knees went numb again, and the frost started collecting on the inside of his nose. He brushed her hair once, soft. Then he shifted her, gently, carefully, not for burial, not yet, just to move her warmth closer to the others. They needed it more now, she would have said the same. And then he did something no man would admit to. He lit her bonnet. It burned fast, fast and angry, wool and ribbon and prayer. The flames licked the side of the kettle and cast mad shadows on the snow roof above them, shadows that danced like memories. It gave off heat for all of 4 minutes, enough to stop the baby's cough for a moment, enough to pull Lottie's eyes from his face. But the smell, Lord, the smell of it. He still remembered that more than the warmth. The scent of his wife's bonnet curling into smoke, stitched by her own hands, now turned to ash in a place where the sky was never seen. He knew it was only a beginning. They would need more, so he took off his own belt and fed that to the fire next. Then the soles of his boots, carved off with a broken knife. Then he broke the old baby cradle they'd used as a sled. Every item, every scrap of wood or cloth that wasn't essential, he judged like a butcher weighing cuts. Use it now or die later. He ran numbers in his head with no arithmetic behind them. 1 hour of heat meant no frostbite for the baby. 2 hours meant Jack would stay breathing. It wasn't survival, it was barter. Sacrifice turned to arithmetic. Outside, the blizzard howled like a god drunk on rage. No sun, no stars, just a leaden grey churn that made night and day indistinguishable. The snow thickened so heavy and constant, it no longer fell in flakes but in solid veils. He knew the cabin wouldn't survive. He had left the door open to let the smoke out, and the chimney wouldn't draw right anyway. If it hadn't collapsed already, it was surely no safer than a coffin. Inside the snow shelter, days passed. They became something beyond countable. No light, no markers, just the rhythm of waking and breathing and checking pulses. When someone coughed, it was a hymn. When someone stirred, it was a kind of salvation. On what Harold guessed was the 6th or 7th day, Lottie woke and whispered something he couldn't hear. He leaned closer, ear to her chapped lips. "What if she's still listening?" she said. He didn't ask who. He knew. Children don't see death the way adults do. To Lottie, May hadn't vanished. She had just gone silent, watching, judging. "I think she is," Harold whispered back. Lottie nodded once, solemn. "Then don't let the baby die." It wasn't a request. It was a command, from a child, from a wife, from the last scrap of love left in a world that had frozen all else solid. So Harold began to dig again. Not to escape, not yet, but to expand the shelter. He used the broken kettle as a scoop, dug outward and upward, careful not to breach the surface and invite collapse. He needed a place to move, to stretch, to think. The walls closed in tighter every day, not physically, but in the mind. He could see it in Jack's 1,000-yard stare, in Lottie's muttering. He needed space, so he carved a new room, a chamber of cold sanity, a tunnel that led nowhere but gave the illusion of more. And in that new chamber, he built a shrine. He did not call it that, but he took what little he had left and laid it there. The scorched iron ring from the kettle, the curled black ribbon from May's bonnet, the broken buckle from his boot. He arranged them in the shape of a circle, not religious, not quite, but a shape of purpose, something to focus on, to say, this is where the warmth was, this is where the love stood before it broke. And when the children were awake, he made them sit near it. He told them stories there, not of knights or cities or angels, but of May. Your mama, he said one night, once made pancakes without flour, just acorns and hope, and it was the best breakfast I ever had. Did she cry when she made them? Jack asked. No, Harold lied. She sang. The baby gurgled once, and the sound echoed through the tunnel like bells in a ruined church. On what he guessed was the 10th day, the food gave out. What little dried cornmeal they'd scraped from the bottom of the sack was gone. The baby had long since stopped nursing. His body simply no longer produced anything. He tried to chew old leather into something edible, but it only made him sick. He took a bite of bark once and passed out for an hour. That was when the dreams started. Dreams of fire, of May, of the shelter melting and revealing green fields beneath, as if winter were just a cruel dream. Dreams of townsfolk walking past without seeing them, eyes blind to the snow dome like it was a secret stitched into the fabric of the mountain. But the worst dream was the one that came again and again. In it, Harold stood outside the shelter, hammering a cross into the ground. Only the names on the cross weren't carved yet. The wood was blank, and every time he tried to carve the first letter, J for Jack, or L for Lottie, or M for May, the chisel snapped. Every time, he would wake with frost stiff in his beard, his jaw locked, his body half over the baby, shivering so hard he could barely breathe. He had one more log. One. He'd hidden it, kept it tucked behind the back wall of the snow shelter, buried in a tin box that once held nails. He'd saved it, not for warmth, but for the signal. The final act. The thing he would burn if, and only if he knew someone was coming. Something visible. A flare. A last scream into the frozen silence. But on the 11th day, he nearly used it anyway. Not for signal. For survival. The baby was wheezing now, rasping with a sound like paper tearing. Jack had stopped moving entirely, and only blinked once an hour. Lottie still watched him, always watching. That's what broke him. Her eyes. He pulled the tin box out, unwrapped the log, stared at it. It was just wood, just an ugly chunk of birch with a split knot in the side. He almost threw it into the kettle. Almost. But something in him said, wait one more night. And that night, just before dawn, or what he thought was dawn, for the air in the shelter changed, grew softer somehow. He heard a sound that did not belong. A voice, far off, calling through the snow. Hello! Harold didn't dare believe it. He pressed his ear to the vent hole. Again. Hello? Anyone? Then the unmistakable jingle of a harness, the crunch of boot in ice. The mountain had sent a miracle, but Harold had nothing left to give it. He lit the log. He fed it every last scrap of burnable trash he had, and the black smoke that billowed out the vent hole that day. That was the reason the search party stopped. That was the reason they dug. That was the reason they found 4 bodies, 3 of them breathing. And Harold hadn't spoken a word by the time they pulled him out. He just looked up at the sky, eyes swollen, and whispered, "She kept us warm." They thought he meant May, but he meant the shelter, and he meant the love she left behind. They pulled him out last, not because they wanted to, but because that's how he wanted it. He made them take the baby first, then Jack, then Lottie. He didn't speak, didn't move at first, just nodded once, like a man finally letting go of a stone too heavy for his chest. The moment the rescue party cracked open the top of the snow dome, it was like breaking into a sealed jar of breath. The inside fogged instantly, a moist warmth escaping that no one could believe came from such a fragile hollow. They thought it was a miracle. It wasn't. It was pain, patience, madness, and love. The man who crawled out wasn't the same one who built the cabin or hunted elk. That Harold Granger had lines in his face and calluses on his hands, but still stood like a man who had hope. This one was bent, eyes sunken, lips raw and torn, hands blackened down the fingers. He had sacrificed everything: blood, sanity, even parts of his mind, to keep that impossible shelter breathing just long enough for 3 small lives to stay warm in a season that killed everything else. They didn't take him to the nearest homestead. They carried him and the children straight to town, all 4 swaddled like corpses in wool and fur. The Granger name was barely known before, just another cabin on a forgotten ridge. But by the time the sled rolled into town behind the mules, the story had already begun to travel. And in a town like Bitter Hollow, stories moved faster than doctors. The doctor's hands shook when he examined the baby, not from cold, but disbelief. The child had minor frostbite around the toes and one ear, but otherwise, pink-cheeked, breathing shallow but strong. They should be dead, the doctor said, not to anyone in particular, just into the room, as if hoping someone would correct him. This baby should be blue, frozen, the lungs should have collapsed. Jack and Lottie were the same. Weak, yes, gaunt, but intact, alive in ways others that week had not been. 5 other families hadn't made it, not even those with proper stoves and chimneys. And yet here were 3 children who had spent nearly 2 weeks in a snow hole, warmed by nothing but kindling and grief, blinking up at strangers like they had never known a storm at all. Harold didn't speak until the 2nd day. He sat in the doctor's back room, wrapped in a borrowed coat, drinking broth one slow spoonful at a time. His hands were bandaged, the tips of 2 fingers were black to the bone. He wouldn't let the doctor take them off yet. "Not until I've held them," he said. "Held who?" He didn't answer. That night he asked for ink and paper. He could barely grip the pen, but he scrawled a message to the preacher himself. "Don't bury her in the churchyard. Bury her up there, where she saved them." The preacher refused at first. "It ain't sanctified ground," he told the rescue party. "It's just snow and pine and wind. A body don't belong buried up in the wild." But the story had grown. Townsfolk who never met Harold began to take sides. Some called it foolishness. Others whispered the word holy. They spoke of the shelter like it was a temple, a place touched by something deeper than warmth. The women clutched their children tighter when they heard it. The men, most of them hardened loggers and ranchers, grew quiet when Harold passed. No one dared say it aloud, but it showed in their eyes. They didn't know if he was a hero or something else, something broken, marked. The sheriff tried to be practical about it. "You can't bury her in a snowbank," he told Harold. "Come spring, it'll melt, flood, wash out." Harold just stared through him. "Then I'll build her a home better than the last one." And he did. By the 3rd week, despite his wounds, Harold returned to the mountain. He didn't bring the children. They stayed in town under the care of a widow who had lost her own 2 sons that same freeze. Lottie never left her little brother's side, and Jack refused to speak unless Harold was in the room. But they stayed, and Harold climbed. No one offered to go with him. They didn't know if he'd come back. He reached the shelter before midday. The snow had packed hard by then, but the dome still stood, sagging slightly where the heat had warped it. He dug into it again, not to save, but to honor. The space inside was still marked with black soot. A scrap of the kettle handle remained, and there, in the middle, a small depression in the snow where May had lain. He didn't cry. He sat there in silence, the way a man sits beside a grave when he's not quite sure if the ghost's gone yet. Then he went to work. It took him 2 weeks. He slept outside in a canvas tent, ate dried meat given by the town's butcher, and hauled stone by hand from the ridge below. He built a cairn, not tall but wide. He laid flat stones first, then curved them into a shell. At the center, he placed what little of May's belongings had survived: her ribbon, the burnt kettle rim, a lock of her hair braided into twine by Lottie. He didn't call it a grave. He called it her room. He shaped the stones to mirror the dome, insulated it with moss and pine pitch. When it was done, he carved a line into the lintel above the entrance. She burned the last log. That was all. He returned to town changed again, quieter, eyes sunken deeper. But when he held his children, the lines on his face softened, not with joy, not even relief, but something older, a kind of peace only known to men who have faced the worst and come back with something worth holding. The town never quite knew what to make of him after that. Some kept their distance. Others tried to get the full story from the children, but Lottie refused to tell it the same way twice. Sometimes she said the fire never went out. Other times she said they sang songs to the smoke, and it answered. Jack never said anything about the snow shelter at all. And the baby? He would grow up never knowing May, except as the woman who gave her warmth to the wind and asked nothing back. That spring, when the thaw came and the roads cleared, a traveler came through, some surveyor from out east, scouting land for a telegraph line. He heard the story at the tavern, heard the words snow dome, single log, father's madness. He went up the trail himself, took measurements, poked around, tried to replicate it in his journal. He returned a week later and declared it impossible. No way it held heat, he told the barkeep. No venting, no insulation worth spit. It should have collapsed under its own weight. The heat from the bodies alone should have melted the inner walls, and drowned them in slush. Unless, he trailed off. Unless what? Someone asked. The man shook his head. Unless they weren't alone in there. No one asked what he meant. The shelter remained. The cairn, too. Harold never returned to it after the spring. He built a new cabin near town, closer to help, never remarried, raised the children until they were strong enough to carry what he no longer could. Lottie became a school teacher, Jack a carpenter. The baby, Jonas, never stopped asking about the snow shelter, even when he was grown. One day, years later, Harold gave him the kettle rim. Just metal, he said. Just a thing that held the heat long enough to matter. Jonas held it like a relic. I wish I could have remembered her, he said. You do, Harold replied. Every time you light a fire. And in his eyes, for just a moment, flickered the same glow that once burned in a snow dome high on the ridge. A light so faint, so fragile, and yet stubborn enough to survive the deadliest freeze the mountain ever knew. The year the snow shelter saved Harold Granger's family came to be known around Bitter Hollow as the Winter of Black Wind. That's how folks remembered it, not for its cold, though it froze cattle in mid-step and turned creeks into ropes of glass, but for the stories that came after. Every family that lost someone that winter had their own version. They said the wind moaned like a widow, said it screamed down the gullies like judgment, but only one family had lived through it inside a pile of snow, warmed by a single log and the memory of a woman who had died smiling. That story spread in ways Harold couldn't control, didn't want to control, and as the years stretched on, it stopped being just a story. It became legend, not in the fairy tale sense. There were no fairy godmothers or enchanted flints, no voices in the wind promising salvation, but legend in the way only a true tale twisted through memory can become, shaped by grief, polished by awe, sharpened by the silence of those who lived it. By the third spring after the shelter, kids at the town school were drawing pictures of a glowing snow dome, with halos and fire inside it. Lottie, teaching arithmetic by then, would erase them gently and tell her students to focus on sums, but she never told them to stop believing it. She just didn't want to explain how much blood and frost lay beneath those innocent sketches. Harold didn't speak of it again, not to Jack, not to Jonas, not even to Lottie. He went about his life like a man walking between two different planes, one foot in the present, the other still buried beneath snow. He never left town again, never went back to trapping. He took up carpentry, working quietly in a shed behind their new cabin, shaping chairs and cradles and fence rails with the same hands that had scraped May's body into place beside their children. When folks asked why he never remarried, he'd say, I already had one miracle in my life. Don't want to press my luck. Some winters, townsfolk still made the pilgrimage to the ridge. They'd climb up, boots crunching through fresh powder, and visit the cairn. It had settled and cracked some with time, but the stones still stood in their arc. No one touched them, no one dared. They left offerings instead, scraps of cloth, a bent nail, sometimes even a piece of wood inscribed with initials or prayers. One winter, someone left a tiny unburned log. Jonas saw it first. He had gone up to clear the path after an early freeze made the trail impassable. He was 16 then, strong from ranch work, but still drawn to that place like a needle to iron. He found the log nestled beside the cairn, wrapped in oiled cloth. There was no name, no note, just one word carved into the grain. Remember. He brought it home and showed it to Harold, who stared at it for a long time before finally turning away. Put it on the hearth, he said, but don't burn it, let it watch. And that's what Jonas did. The log sat on the mantel above their fire for decades after, untouched, unburned, always watching, like a sentinel, like a promise. As the children grew and started lives of their own, the shelter remained a quiet thread binding them together. Jack became a builder, known in 3 counties for barns that never buckled, cabins that withstood storms others couldn't. He never said why he was so particular about venting, about snow loads, about airtight seals, but anyone who worked beside him knew he measured insulation not in inches, but in lives. Lottie stayed in Bitter Hollow. She taught, kept to herself, married a local tinsmith late in life, and had no children. Some said she never recovered from that winter. Others said she simply knew no other child could ever match the weight of the ones she'd kept alive by sheer will in that dome of death. Jonas left, not far, but far enough. He became a traveling tinker, walking the roads with a cart full of wares, always circling back every season or so. He never stayed long, always drifting like smoke, but wherever he went he told stories, not of May, not by name, but of warmth in cold, of love that burned hotter than frost. Stories that made listeners pause and think maybe, just maybe, there was something holy in the act of not giving up. He never said the story was his. He never needed to. Harold lived to see 82. He died in his sleep, one hand resting on the wooden rim of the burned kettle he kept by his bed. His last words, spoken to no one, were, "She's still warm, ain't she?" The funeral was small, just the children, a few townsfolk, and the preacher, an old man now, nearly blind, who still remembered refusing Harold's request to bury May up the mountain. He did better this time. They buried Harold beside her. The ground was softer now, thawed and green, but Jack and Jonas brought stone anyway. They built the second cairn by hand, beside the first, using Harold's original shape. Two domes, side by side. Not graves, rooms, still shaped like the shelter, still arching against time and snow. And between them, set into the stones with pitch and prayer, Jonas mounted a plaque he'd carved himself from the same tree that once shaded their first cabin. It said only, "They burned together, and we lived." That winter, Bitter Hollow faced another storm, not as cruel as the one that took May, but strong enough to buckle fences, snap roof beams, and ice over windows until the moon looked drowned. And in the worst of it, when the drifts blocked the road and the cattle couldn't be reached, two brothers and a sister met again in the cabin where they'd grown up. Jack had brought tools, Jonas brought food, Lottie brought only a folded scrap of wool from the old bonnet. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. They lit a fire and sat before it, watching the smoke curl like old ghosts. Jonas looked up at one point and said, "She would have liked this, wouldn't she?" Lottie nodded. "She's here." Jack, never a man of many words, added only, "And so is he." Outside, the wind howled again, but it was different now. It no longer carried threat, only memory, only the breath of a family that had once done the impossible and kept each other warm through the darkest, deadliest winter the mountain ever saw. Long after Harold Granger's hands had turned to dust in the soil beneath that wind-battered ridge, long after the wood of the old shelter had rotted into mulch and the mountain trail faded to scrub and moss, there were still those who walked up to that place in winter and said nothing. They didn't come with cameras, didn't bring journals or microphones or questions, just quiet, and sometimes grief. A mother with a child's blanket in her pocket, a man with a letter in his coat, unopened since the thaw, a girl who'd never met Harold, but felt something in the way the trees bent inward toward the twin cairns, as if the wind itself bowed in respect. They came because the story endured, not the way other stories did, with names and dates etched in polished stone or rewritten in newspapers. No, this one lived in the cracks, in a patch of scorched moss, in the rust ring of a forgotten kettle, in the silence between gusts when the world held its breath, just for a second, like it remembered something holy, because that shelter, built with a broken spade and one last breath of hope, wasn't a miracle. It was a choice, and that choice became a fire passed hand to hand, even in a world grown colder. Years after Harold's death, Bitter Hollow changed. The telegraph came, then electricity, new roads carved paths, where wagon ruts once fought rock and sleet. Most of the old cabins were torn down, replaced with tin-roofed homes and wooden porches, wide and proud. But no one ever built near the ridge, not even when the land was offered free to any man willing to clear it. The space where Harold's snow shelter once stood remained untouched. The cairns still sat like sentinels, moss-gathered but unbroken, their stones thick with lichen and time. Some said the land was cursed, others said it was blessed, but most folks knew enough not to name it. Jonas returned less often after Harold passed. He took his cart further downrange, into Nevada, and up into Idaho, sometimes to the coast. But he always came back for winter. No matter how far he traveled, no matter what county he wandered into, he was always in Bitter Hollow by the time the first frost bit down on the fence posts. He never explained why, just said, "There are stories that only make sense in the cold." He stopped tinkering in his 60s and took up mending instead. People brought him things, broken chairs, cracked clocks, old radios. He fixed them with hands that had learned to mend more than wood. He didn't talk about the snow dome, but everyone who met him knew they were meeting a man who had lived through something deeper than most would ever understand. He kept the unburned log on his mantle all those years. He never lit it. When he died, Lottie was already gone, passed quiet in her sleep 3 winters before. Jack had buried her near the old cabin, under the same tree that used to drop apples only once every 5 years. He'd carved her name into the bark, soft and neat, Lottie Granger, who watched the fire when it tried to die. It wasn't poetry, it was truth. Jack himself was nearing 85 when he made one last climb up the ridge. He took his son with him, a boy grown old now, with children of his own. Together they cleared the trail, slow and careful. It had been years since Jack had gone up. His knees howled, his back screamed, but he said he wanted to see the place again before his bones gave out completely. They found the cairns just as they'd always been, but the snow around them was strange that year. Not thicker, thinner, almost like it had melted there, even though the rest of the ridge was buried, as if something warm had passed through, just once. Jack sat by the cairn for a long time, said nothing. Then without a word he reached into his pack and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. It was the log, the same one Jonas had kept, the one no one ever dared burn. He unwrapped it slow, like unrolling memory. His son watched in silence. "What are you going to do with it?" the son asked. Jack didn't answer right away. He stood, shuffled to the space between the cairns, and knelt in the snow. His hands moved slow but sure. He dug a shallow hole between the two stone shelters, just deep enough to bury something small. Then he laid the log down, covered it, pressed the snow firm. A fire don't always need to burn to be passed along, he said. And that was that. That winter was mild, the mildest in decades. The mountain seemed to hold its breath again, just a little, just long enough for people to whisper that something had shifted. They still tell the story now, in Bitter Hollow and beyond. It never sounds the same twice. Sometimes Harold is a trapper, sometimes a preacher, sometimes he has 5 kids, sometimes 1, sometimes May lives, sometimes she dies on the first night. The names change, the years blur, but the core stays. A father, a snow shelter, a single log, and the heat that outlived them all. They tell it in schools now. The local teacher, a woman named Annie, who grew up 2 counties over, made it part of her winter curriculum. Not for science, not for history, for something else. Resilience, sacrifice, hope. She takes her students up the ridge each year, just before the thaw. They walk in a line, quiet as they can be, and leave something small near the cairns, a button, a twig, a folded paper with a name on it. They never touch the stones. They never speak above a whisper. But once, after all the children had placed their offerings, Annie stayed behind and sat by the cairns alone. She was young, not even 30, but there was something in the way she held herself, shoulders drawn, hands folded, that said she knew what it meant to carry someone's warmth. She pulled a small box from her coat, opened it. Inside was a burned ring of metal, blackened, bent. She'd found it years ago in her grandmother's belongings, long after she'd passed. No note, no explanation, just a tiny scrap of soot-smudged paper tucked beside it. One word, Granger. She placed the ring gently on the cairn, and when she stood to leave, the wind shifted, just slightly, just enough to lift her hair and whisper something she couldn't quite hear, but she smiled, because she knew the warmth had never really left. It had just gone quiet for a while, buried beneath snow, waiting like fire always does.